Hello, I'm Warren Fahey, and here's more tales about the good old bad old days. And today we're going down to Woolloomooloo, or as most people affectionately know it as, the Loo. It's hard to believe, but at one stage in the history of Sydney, Woolloomooloo was the most desirable place to live. It was very convenient for those who wanted to brown nose with the governor. You just walked up the hill. It was also beautifully situated on the harbour and right next door to the governor's domain, which was always there as an open area. The Loo, well, it has a checkered history. I still find it absolutely fascinating to walk around. I feel the ambience of Woolloomooloo and all the years that it represents. When it was originally an Indigenous area, it was sort of related to where the Indigenous community held battles. We don't know if they were battles for fun, competitions, or this is where you went to take it out on your enemy. But the name Woolloomooloo, we believe, is from the term place of many kangaroos. So it was obviously a hunting place as well. And of course, the Indigenous people of Sydney, of the Eora Nation, they took advantage of the abundant sea life in Sydney, especially the oysters, which were everywhere around the rocks area of Woolloomooloo. The history is also related fairly squarely to that of Garden Island, which is to the right of Woolloomooloo. And as you probably know, Garden Island got its name because one of the ships of the First Fleet, the Sirius, was anchored there, and the sailors had to grow some fruit and vegetables, and that's why it got the name Garden Island. But that island also has a very solid history with Woolloomooloo as a precinct, a suburb. Originally, when the area was settled, a lot of small worker houses were established there. That's after the big villa houses disappeared. The villa houses, especially of Palmer, John Palmer, and later when he sold it to George Riley, had a lot of little farms where they grew oranges, apples and all sorts of fruits. In particular, they grazed some sheep, wasn't quite suitable for that. And eventually those big estates were carved up for housing. It came into its own really around the 1870s, when there was a lot of these houses built because of the increasing demand for the harbour area to be a working harbour. And as we know, later on, after Federation, there were some substantial wharves built there, including the Finger Wharf, which remains today, thankfully. But that wharf itself, built in 1911, 1912, originally to send wheat and wool and other produce overseas. It's still, if you go to the Avolio Hotel and look inside, you can see how the conveyor system for the wool bales would have worked to take to the ship. Unfortunately, not long after it was open, it exported something far more important, and that was men going away to war in the First World War. It was a struggle. There was a time in the 1980s that that wharf was about to be destroyed. It needed a lot of work, and thankfully it was protected I was on a small group of people that started to shout and saying, "You cannot destroy this wharf. It's part of the landscape of Woolloomooloo." To the left of Woolloomooloo is the Botanical Gardens and the Domain, but the interesting area to me is where the Boy Charlton Pool is today, because there'd been a number of pools in that area since the very beginning of these settlement days. The colonials, they probably washed once a week in the English habit, and they'd stroll down from where the main settlement was in the rocks over to where Boy Charlton is now, and they'd bathe in the harbour. And in those days, people were pretty terrified of sharks in the harbour, and rightly so, because there were a lot. But there was also the fact that not many people knew how to swim until the beginning of the 20th century. Anyway, they'd go down there for their ablution. So what the colonial authorities did, they got a ship called the Cornwallis, and they anchored it there on the wedge of that inlet, and then they built a little protecting wall on the other side, which allowed people to swim and bathe without the fear of sharks. And then it progressively became a number of pools that enclosed where they taught swimming. One of them got burnt down, so they built another one. And eventually the city corporation took over the management of the pools. They did have a problem apparently for a while, because the ferry used to come over from Circular Quay and Mania and used to have a ferry stop at one of the wharves at Woolloomooloo. And the biggest problem there was that the young boys who used to sit and sunbake on the rocks near the pools were waving their willies at the passengers, and they were brought up before the water police apparently, so that stopped. The other aspect of Woolloomooloo is that it became the home for a lot of people who worked on the wharves, and they were hard cases, many of them. And we know at one stage in the latter part of the 19th century, there were something like 250 drinking establishments in Woolloomooloo alone. Some of them were legal, hotels and taverns and inns, and there were a few sly grog places as well. Of course, the temptation for the sailors who were stationed over at Garden Island to come ashore and go drinking was quite major. And as we know, in the 20th century, when the island was used for R&R, rest and recreation, right through from World War I to World War II especially, where we had so many American and British ships coming into Australia for R&R, and then again during the Vietnam War. So those drinking establishments got a lot of use. The other thing we know about Woolloomooloo is that in the 1920s and 30s, it was the home of Tilly Devine, who was with Kate Lee, the two people that ran the brothels and the illegal drinking and the drug trade, and really they were always at war, these two Sheilas. You wouldn't want to get into a back lane in Woolloomooloo with either of them. And as we know, in King's Cross there was a big showdown in Kellett Street, and razor gangs hit the newspaper headlines continually. So it was a pretty rough reputation that Woolloomooloo inherited by the 1920s and 30s. It also had been hit really badly around 1901 when the influenza epidemic swept Sydney. There were accusations that a lot of these diseases were actually coming out of Woolloomooloo and the rocks, where there was low socio-economic housing and a lot of rubbish built up, and there were rat sightings and so forth. There were thoughts that the entire suburb should have been bulldozed and rebuilt, which would have been a great shame. As it happened, the government authorities really are the ones to blame for wrecking Woolloomooloo. They put the railway right through and split the suburb, and it was not only a physical split, it was also an emotional split that destroyed a lot of the life in the area. Shops moved out and were abandoned. People saw it as a second-rate place to live. So it had a pretty checkered history. But, I believe that its time is yet to come again when, it will be a better managed part of Sydney. It's so close to the proximity of Sydney, the parks, and I'm sure it'll change. One of the things that people don't realise is that in the 1870s, it was the site for Sydney's fish market. There was a very large fish market established in Woolloomooloo, and that's where people went to buy all sorts of seafoods. Apparently it was quite a noisy place, people shouting out, fresh mackerel, fresh this, fresh oysters, whatever. And those glory days obviously left when the fish market was resituated over at Pyrmont. So, interesting place, Woolloomooloo. And they, of course, always used to look up at Potts Point, which they referred to it as Woolloomooloo Heights.